So now we will look at the regions of the British colonies, with a particular emphasis on the theme of geography and environment, as well as to continue look at the motivations for why these regions were settled. The regions all had some similarities, but also had significant differences, both in their environment and their motivation to settlement. We will look at the establishment of the British colonies by region rather than in chronological order. The Chesapeake and the Southern Colonies. This comprises the modern states of Maryland and Virginia, which are the Chesapeake region, plus North and South Carolina and Georgia, all of which are collectively known as the Southern Colonies. Following the failure of the Roanoke colony, Queen Elizabeth I would allow no further attempts at settlement, believing them to be too costly. But after her death, her successor, James I, granted permission for the formation of a joint stock company who planned a settlement north of the old Roanoke location. 104 settlers landed in May 1607 with company instructions to build a secure settlement, find gold, and seek a water route to the Pacific, all for the economic gain of their company backers. The traditional telling of early Jamestown history portrayed these pioneers as ill-suited for the task. Certainly many were noblemen who were likely unsuited to heavy labor, but archaeological research at the site of James Fort suggests that many of the artisans, craftsmen, and laborers who accompanied the gentleman leaders made every effort to build a successful colony. The location was far enough from Spanish settlements to not likely be noticed, and it was a protected site that was very defensible if they were attacked. But it wasn't just the Spanish that the English had to worry about, as they were almost immediately attacked by the Powhatan Indians, and continuous conflict took a toll on the population. The winter of 1609 to 1610 would be the worst for the young colony, a starving time when the natives set up a siege of the fort, which limited hunting and other food forays. The resulting food shortages led to the outbreak of disease. Starvation and illnesses like dysentery and typhoid reduced the population significantly. The colonists even resorted to eating shoe leather and butchering their horses that had been brought from England the summer before. George Percy wrote, "Then having fed upon horses and other beasts as long as they lasted, we were glad to make shift with vermin as dogs, cats, and mice." There were also charges of cannibalism, with starving settlers digging up dead corpses out of graves to eat them, and others, quote, licked up the blood which had fallen from their weakened fellows, unquote. The Jamestown Rediscovery archaeologists in 2012 uncovered forensic evidence of survivable cannibalism. Approximately 300 settlers did begin that winter of 1609 in James Fort, but only 60 were alive by the spring of 1610. Initially, the survivors planned to abandon the colony, but a new ship of supplies, new settlers, and a new governor, Lord de Lavar, prevented that from happening. By 1612, the colony had discovered a new means of support, since no gold was ever found, and that support came when John Rolfe successfully cultivated the first tobacco crop in the colony, an industry that to this point had been controlled by the Spanish in the Caribbean. 2 years later, he married the daughter of Chief Powhatan, a girl named Pocahontas, who later changed her name to Rebecca when she converted to Christianity. And that led to a temporary truce with the native people. By 1617, tobacco exports to England totaled 20,000 pounds of dried tobacco leaf. The following year, shipments had more than doubled. Just 12 years later, in 1630, 1.5 million pounds of tobacco was being exported from Virginia annually. Jamestown had found its source of wealth in agriculture instead of gold, but it still wasn't enough for the colony to be profitable, and it was eventually taken over by the Crown. After the establishment of Jamestown, the remainder of the Chesapeake and the Southern Colonies would be established. The third English colony overall, and the second in the Chesapeake, was Maryland, Like Plymouth, which we'll look at when we get to the New England region, religion was a primary motivating factor for Maryland's creation. George Calvert, the first Lord Baltimore, a high-ranking member of the government under James I, he and his family converted to Catholicism, which forced him to give up those lucrative government positions, as Catholics were not allowed to serve in the government in England. Having done many favors for the king, which usually meant loaning him money, he approached James's son Charles I about getting a grant of land in the colonies. But George Calvert died shortly before the charter was granted, but his son Cecil Calvert, the second Lord Baltimore, continued with the plan and was given the charter in 1634. He then sent two of his younger brothers, along with the first settlers, to manage the colony. Maryland was intended to be a haven for Catholics who were persecuted in England, although about 2/3 of the first settlers were not Catholic at all. The colony would be run a little bit like a feudal holding, with Baltimore owning the land and settlers paying him an annual rent, which means economics was also a motivating factor, but again, it was still primarily religion. But tensions between the wealthy Catholic landowners and the poor Protestant farmers persisted. In 1849, the Maryland legislature passed an Act of Toleration to try and rein things in, which would authorize all Christians to worship freely in the colony. Eventually, though, the government was seized from the control of the Calverts, and partly due to the slow response the colony had to the ascent of King William of Orange and Queen Mary, who was the daughter of James II, when James II himself was deposed for converting to Catholicism and then begetting a Catholic heir, who of course would have inherited before any of his older Protestant sisters. At that time, Catholics lost all political rights in Maryland, at least until the American Revolution. Now, there was a bit of a break in establishing colonies in the mid-17th century because of the Civil War in England, during which Charles I was beheaded, and England was ruled over by Oliver Cromwell as Lord Protector. But in 1660, the monarchy was restored, with Charles II taking power. So the colonies that were created under his rule were dubbed the Restoration Colonies. And Carolina was one of these. It was established initially as one colony and governed by proprietors who sought economic gain. The southern part served first as support for colonies in the British West Indies. The cultivation of rice in the plantation system quickly became very profitable there, and planters in the hundreds and slaves in the tens of thousands soon inhabited southern Carolina. The geography of the area was particularly suited to this type of plantation agriculture, with broad plains and easily navigable rivers extending deep into the Piedmont. At the heart of the colony was the port town of Charlestown, established in 1669. A natural harbor allowed easy access to trade all over the Atlantic. Because of the dominance of plantation agriculture, African slaves would quickly become a majority of the population by the middle of the 18th century. Now, the earliest Europeans in the northern part of the Carolina colony were primarily displaced former indentured servants drifting southward from the Chesapeake region. Most established small tobacco farms, and though river transportation was possible, it was not quite as conducive to the establishment of large plantations like you'd seen in the southern part of the colony. Slavery existed in the northern part of the Carolina colony, but in far smaller numbers than in the neighboring regions. These were more subsistence farmers that also grew some crops for export. The inhabitants there felt as though the aristocrats from Virginia and the Charleston area looked down on them. Northern Carolina, kind of like Rhode Island in the north, tended to draw the region's discontented masses. As the two parts of the Carolina colony grew more and more distinct, calls for a formal split emerged. First, they were divided into separate provinces in 1669, and then in 1712, they officially became the colonies of North and South Carolina, though they were still both owned by the same group of proprietors. By 1719, South Carolina had been taken over by the Crown, and the same would happen to North Carolina in 1729. In 1733, Georgia would become the last of these southern colonies to be established by James Oglethorpe, and its purpose was twofold. First, it was to be a buffer between Spanish Florida and the wealthier Carolina colonies to the north, and this was especially important as England had been through 2 wars against Spain recently and wanted to prevent further attacks on their people. A second purpose was to provide opportunities for England's poor, especially those who languished in debtors' prisons. By removing them from custody, they would no longer be a drain on the nation's coffers, and they could serve the purpose of defending the wealthier colonies to the north from Spanish and native attacks. Now, shifting northward, the New England colonies consist of all of the colonies that were east and north of New York, including the modern-day states of Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Maine, which at the time was officially a part of Massachusetts. It was here that the emphasis was less on economics and more on religious motivation being the primary reason these colonies were established. The founders of these New England colonies, of course, had an entirely different mission than the Jamestown settlers. Although, they still hoped for economic gain, their true goal was spiritual. Fed up with the overly ceremonial Church of England, Puritans sought to recreate society in a manner that they believed God truly intended it to be. And they followed the teachings of John Calvert, who broke from the Catholic Church around 1530. King James I and his son Charles I supported the Church of England, but secretly admired the ceremonies of the Catholic Church. And so to these kings, Calvin was a heretic, a man whose soul was doomed for his religious views. Now, the Pilgrims who came to Plymouth Colony were called separatists in England because of their desire to separate from the Anglican Church, and they were persecuted by agents of the throne as well. The Puritans wanted to purify the Church of England from any remaining Catholic taint, and they still often experienced the same degree of harassment. By the 2nd and 3rd decades of the 1600s, each group had decided that England was really no place for them to put their somewhat controversial beliefs into practice. Now, first, these Pilgrim separatists had tried to establish a community in the Netherlands, where they were welcomed, but they returned to England, believing that there was simply too much temptation and too much godlessness in the Netherlands. Then in September of 1620, over 100 people boarded the Mayflower, headed for the New World. Less than a third of them were separatists, with the rest being various immigrants, adventurers, and land speculators, since they were originally headed to the Virginia colony with the plan to live north of Jamestown under the same charter that had been granted to the citizens there. Supposedly lost at sea, they happened upon a piece of land that would become known as Cape Cod, and they were afraid to go further south because winter was quickly approaching since they arrived in December of that year, and so they decided to stay and build their colony right where they were, thus establishing Plymouth as the second English colony, and the first in the New England region. Of course, these Pilgrims had an important question to answer before they actually set ashore, since they weren't landing within the jurisdiction of the Virginia Company. They had no charter to govern them, so who would rule their society? In the landmark Mayflower Compact that winter, 1620, the Pilgrims decided that they would simply rule themselves based on the majority rule of the townsmen, essentially setting up a tradition of self-rule that would later lead to things like town meetings and elected legislatures throughout New England. The major similarity between these Plymouth settlers and those in Jamestown was that they experienced great human suffering. Now, November, December was too late to plant crops, and many settlers would die of scurvy and malnutrition during that first winter. Of the 102 original Mayflower passengers, only 44 survived the first winter. Ultimately, the kindness of a local Native American saved them. Squanto, a local native who had been kidnapped and taken to England nearly a decade before, and who had managed to return to the New World only to find his entire tribe gone, served as an interpreter with the local tribes. The following spring, he taught these Pilgrims to fertilize the soil with dried fish remains to produce bountiful crops, since the soil where they were at was of too poor of a quality otherwise. With Squanto's assistance, Massasoit, the chief of the nearby Wampanoags, signed a treaty of alliance with the Pilgrims in exchange for assistance with defense against the Narragansett tribe, whereby Massasoit supplemented the food supply of the Pilgrims for the first few years. Now, successful colonies also require strong leaders, and William Bradford would serve as that for the Plymouth colony. After that first winter, he was elected governor and would continue to be elected for the next 30 years. In general, though, despite the suffering of that first year, Plymouth suffered less hardship than the English in Virginia, allowing the colony to grow relatively quickly. Also, having lots of family groups from the very beginning helped quite a bit as well, which gave the settlers of Plymouth many things to be thankful for. Following Plymouth, New England began a rapid period of expansion as other religious dissenters left England for this new colony of Massachusetts Bay, which would be settled to the north of Plymouth. Its founder, John Winthrop, did not want to separate from the Church of England, but instead wanted to focus on purifying it of Catholic taint, so he's a Puritan rather than a separatist. As the head of the joint stock company that established the colony of Massachusetts Bay, he actually found a loophole in the charter and was able to run the company from the colony itself rather than running the company from London, continuing this idea of self-rule in the colonies that had sort of started with Plymouth. They elected a legislature, echoing the desire for self-government that was at this point already starting to be seen in other English colonies, specifically Virginia, which had started its legislature back in 1619. Although ministers were prohibited from holding political office, many of the most important decisions were made by the clergy in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. In 1636, Harvard College was established there for the purpose of training Puritan ministers, beginning yet another long-standing practice of emphasizing education in the region. By the end of the 1630s, as part of a great migration of Puritans out of England, nearly 14,000 more Puritan settlers came to Massachusetts, and the colony began to spread. And in 1691, Plymouth Colony, which still did not officially have a charter of its own, was simply absorbed into the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Interestingly, for a colony that had fled persecution in England, Massachusetts Bay was quick to persecute anyone who did not hold the same religious views as themselves. Members of other faiths had no rights and were quick to be punished, imprisoned, and usually banished from the colony. As dissent occurred, those who were banished left to form new colonies. Thomas Hooker, who established Hartford, which was Connecticut, had objected to the idea of linking voting rights to church membership. Although the religious practices were virtually the same in Connecticut as in Massachusetts Bay Colony, there would be more political rights for non-church members. The citizens of Connecticut were also the first to enact a written constitution for their colony, setting a model for other colonial charters and even eventual state constitutions. Roger Williams was banished from Massachusetts Bay in 1636 because of two main ideas that challenged Puritan ideals. First, he believed in complete religious freedom, and therefore the complete separation of church and state. Puritans tended to think theirs was the one true faith. And second, he believed that taking land from the Native Americans without proper payment was unfair. Upon his banishment, he purchased land from the Narragansett Indians to the south and founded the colony of Rhode Island, then called Providence Plantations. Here, there would be complete religious freedom, so many dissenters came here seeking refuge, one of them being Anne Hutchinson. Now, Puritans in general believed in a concept known as predestination. This doctrine holds that God is all-powerful and all-knowing, therefore the fate of each individual soul is known to God at birth. Nothing that an individual can do or say would change their fate. Hutchinson thought that the enforcement of proper behavior from church members through a variety of laws and social customs conflicted with this doctrine of predestination, asking simply, if God has predetermined for me salvation or damnation, how could any behavior of mine change my fate? Now, this sort of thinking was seen as extremely dangerous and possibly leading to anarchy. And when many people began to gather at her home to hear her commentary on the weekly sermon, This really kind of started to put a challenge to the Puritan order, and when you consider the fact that her leadership position as a woman made her seem all the more dangerous, so she was banished from Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1637. Although she did stay in Rhode Island for a time, she eventually relocated to the Dutch colony of New Netherland to be completely out of the reach of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which at the time was starting to threaten to take over Rhode Island. And she was eventually killed in an attack from Native Americans, along with 5 of her 15 children. New Hampshire was initially settled not long after Plymouth, based on land grants given to 2 proprietors, but a conflicting claim and a general lack of government led to the area being managed by Massachusetts for a while, before eventually legal actions regarding the land claims of the original grant holders and their heirs resulted in new charters and a clarification of boundaries both with Massachusetts and New York once England gained control of the New York area. The mid-17th century, like I said earlier, had seen a break from establishing new colonies because of that Civil War in England. But when Charles II was returned to power, England began to challenge the Dutch and the Swedes for their territories in North America, eventually gaining control of the area that is referred to as the Middle Colonies, which would cover the modern states of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. The Dutch had originally established the colony they called New Amsterdam, again not long after Jamestown was established, starting it as a fur trading outpost, which then developed into a rather thriving commercial venture. They had even welcomed Jewish refugees who had been ousted from Portuguese-controlled areas. Now, the English challenged the Dutch for possession of this area in the 1660s, eventually winning control of all of these colonies. The area was then immediately given over to the control of the Duke of York, the king's brother, which is the future James II, and then renamed New York. Although it was now controlled by England, the people and their customs and institutions were generally allowed to remain. Not long after, a portion of that land was granted by James to some of his friends who renamed it New Jersey. These land grants were originally run as proprietary colonies, much like Maryland had been, and governed as 2 separate provinces, East Jersey and West Jersey, with separate governors and legislatures, at least until the land was taken over by the Crown in 1702, and the 2 portions were united under 1 governor. A significant portion of land to the west of New Jersey was granted to William Penn in payment of a debt that the king owed to Penn's father, who was also named William. Now, William Penn, who got the land grant, was a Quaker, and used this grant to establish a refuge for other Quakers in the early 1680s, although he welcomed people of all faiths to settle in what he was calling Pennsylvania, or Penn's Woods, which was named for his father, not himself. In 1682, the area now known as Delaware, a former Swedish settlement that had been seized by the Dutch and then taken over by the English, was also granted to William Penn. Though he owned both, the colonists of the counties that made up Delaware didn't support the Quaker government and asked to be ruled separately, and in 1701, William Penn allowed for Delaware to create a separate legislature, although Pennsylvania and Delaware would still share a governor, at least until the time of the American Revolution. Pennsylvania would flourish as an agricultural center because it also had access to good ports and could transport grain crops, which it was particularly known for, overseas to help feed portions of Europe. Delaware focused more on a variety of trade, with fishing being a particularly dominant industry. And so that is a look at your 13 colonies grouped together by region. The Southern Colonies, which includes the Chesapeake, the New England Colonies, and the Middle Colonies.